Well, I'm so excited to have Dr. Bradley Bush here with us tonight to talk about neuroinflammation. Bradley's been here. How long have you been here in Minnesota now?
I've now lived here for 17 years.
Oh my gosh. I can't, that's crazy. And you were, and he came from neuroscience, correct, in Wisconsin?
That's correct.
So why don't you tell us, I'm gonna let you take it away in terms of for those who don't know you, introducing yourself a little bit and tell everybody about your wonderful self, because we've known Dr. Bush for quite some time and we're so lucky to have him as part of our Lyme community helping our patients. So Dr. Bush, take it away.
Thank you, Dorian. Hey, thank you for inviting me. And I'm thankful for everyone to join. Now, today I was hoping to have a nice little conversation. So feel free when that moment comes and you want to ask a question, type it into the text box. Dorian's going to be reading them to me. And then likewise, I've given her permission to interrupt me anytime if there's a good question that's timely asked. Okay. Even if it's a bad question, timely asked, as long as it's timely asked. I'm happy to do that so that we can stay as conversational as we want. So my name is Bradley Bush. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I've been practicing medicine here in Minnesota for the last 8 years. Prior to that, I was in business with a commercial laboratory and supplement company. Prior to that, I was on the East Coast doing medicine, which is where I first became highly aware of Lyme disease. Was able to get a training by Dr. Horowitz and was able to be part of a group of early docs in the 2000s to start some of the largest Lyme clinics in New Hampshire. Here in Minnesota, I've continued to have an integrative clinic. My practice does not specialize in Lyme disease, although I am extremely acute of it. My goal usually is looking to see if it is Lyme disease in someone. And then if it's an active disorder, I refer typically to one of the Lyme literate prescribing doctors or practitioners in the area, which we have quite a few great ones that I personally love dearly. So, but I also get a lot of cross referrals because I often will work with patients on a different level at times, or at least multitask in different systems, looking especially when it comes to a lot of chronic illness. And in the infectious disease world, there's a lot of chronic illness that occurs because of the illness and because a lot of the sequelae or byproducts of being ill. Oftentimes, and I'm going to circle all the way around through there. Hence, when I was asked by Dorian to do a lecture today, I thought it was because of the last few years working through COVID and how that has affected our health as a population. The one thing that really has been lingering with COVID, with the long hauler conditions, is a condition that parallels a lot of the Lyme disease issues when it comes to chronic Lyme, persistent Lyme, and even acute Lyme. And that is our topic for today, which is neuroinflammation. So before I jump all the way in there, I am a naturopathic doctor. I own and run an integrative medical clinic in Stillwater, Minnesota, Natural Medicine of Stillwater. We're an integrative clinic of medical doctor, naturopath, chiropractor, and we try to help people as much as we possibly can to the best of our degree. So that's what we try to do, and we try to sleep really well at night, knowing that we do the best we can. So with that much said, I will share my screen, and I have a lot of things on my screen. I just need to pick which one is the right one. Here we go. All right. So with that much said, we're gonna jump into a little neuroinflammation. Now, I know that in all of your conversations that you've had in these extra educational events and during your conferences that you tend to live in the past, neuroinflammation has always been talked about when you talk about infectious disease. it's hard to separate from that. A lot of times people talk about neuroborreliosis. They'll talk about the dementia that could be a long-term sequelae of it. But ultimately, as you can see with the definition, neuroinflammation is an inflammatory response. And that's key because it's inflammation that's oftentimes leading to the problems. This inflammation happens in the brain, in the spinal cord, the central nervous system. And it's caused by a lot of inflammatory products in the body, your cytokines, your chemokines, your secondary messengers, which could be like inflammatory markers, could be hormones, could be a lot of different things. And of course, oxidative stress, so reactive oxygen species. Now, I chose this topic because one of the things that you hear, because we just came through, or we're coming out of, we're kind of like pausing here at the end of a pandemic with COVID. A lot of people are still quite baffled. And of course, you know, maybe a lot of people in the conventional world are truly baffled, but the concept of a long hauler syndrome with COVID, you know, if you're looking at it through a Lyme's lens, yeah, we've been there, done that. We got the T-shirt. That's something that has been around a long time and has been plaguing the Lyme community forever. It's often sometimes used as in some circles, like the CDC, they might say, well, there's no such thing as a chronic Lyme disease, and there's no such thing as persistent Lyme disease, but there is a post-Lyme disease syndrome. And that post-Lyme disease syndrome, the center of that is a secondary disturbance in a lot of systems, including the neural inflammation aspect. Now, I'm not using it in the idea that it is the problem for all persistent and chronic Lyme issues, but it's a hallmark for anyone with chronic and persistent Lyme. It's also a hallmark of someone with acute Lyme who successfully treats it and still has lingering symptoms and issues. And part of that is just like with COVID, you have a massive infection. And the way I like to describe Lyme disease is that you got a category 4 hurricane that hits you. And when that hurricane hits you, there's a lot of damage. Now, you can get out of that hurricane on the other side of it, but not everything is perfect. You just went through a hurricane. And if your house happened to be in that hurricane, if all the gutters weren't properly fastened, if the shingles weren't all the way on, if the siding had any type of malfunction, even if the foundation had some cracks in it, during that storm and that big wind, you're going to get a lot more issues. So when it comes to healthcare, your predispositions that you come into the game, whether ones that you know or don't know, get amplified or turned on and amplified during that time period. And that often leads to a lot of secondary issues. On top of that, the disease itself creates such a massive immune reaction. It creates a huge amount of cytokines, inflammatory markers that trigger and turn on lots of different things in the body, that then you're dealing with all the secondary headwinds that are hitting you. And this is what often confuses it, because these are the symptoms people feel, but the symptoms are secondary to a root cause. That root cause in the case of COVID with long hauler is something that happened and it's gone away and you still have problems. Same thing with infectious diseases. Many times you get an infection and you may have gotten that infection and you took care of it acutely. You may have taken care of it down the road, but that chronic inflammatory reaction leads to a lot of disruption and oftentimes leads to a lot of the neuroinflammation. Let's see if we can. So with the causes of neuroinflammation, now neuroinflammation can be caused by anything that kind of rocks the body, that throws it off kilter. In this particular community, you're extremely aware of infections. Well, okay, we can have neuroinflammation secondary to Lyme disease. Yeah, you can get acute neuroborreliosis. You can get some major brain fog and fatigue, vertigo, you name it. In addition to that, you could also get that from other infections. I mean, you get a nasty enough flu, you can get it. You can get it with a meningitis, go figure. In addition to that, to many other illnesses. And of course, we just coming, like I said, we're coming out of that COVID pandemic, and many of us have all experienced some neuroinflammation acutely with COVID. And of course, unfortunately, there's a lot of people long hauling it with a lot of neuroinflammation. So the other part of it is like, more obvious things like a traumatic brain injury. Yeah, you hit your head against the wall, you hit your head against the steering wheel or the windshield of a car, you get hit by a linebacker, you're good, you can get some major trauma in the brain and some persistent neuroinflammation. And I remember very, very vividly, one of my patients here in Minnesota, she was had persistent issues post Lyme disease. And I remember when I talked to her before, I said, I think that you're out of the woods right now when it came to the infection. But I told her, I'm like, you act as if you had a concussion and you never got over it. Like you're in this chronic concussion state. And lo and behold, when someone has a massive infection, when someone has a chronic infection that persists for years and years and years, if you have a metabolic disorders, if you have other conditions that lead to chronic inflammation and oxidative stress, it's as if you're having a chronic concussed state. You have traumatic brain trauma all the time. And that's what puts you behind the 8 ball. Hard to get around that when you're stuck in that circle. Toxicity. Our toxicity could be from what we consume. That could be alcohol poisoning. That could be drug abuse. That could also be secondhand smoke. That could be carbon monoxide poisoning. That could be the air we breathe, the water we drink, the land that we're supposed to be comfortable in. Toxicity can cause neuroinflammation. I recently had a patient who was in a really fragile state for a couple of different reasons. Lo and behold, they realized that her clothing, every time she was in contact with her clothing, she was getting ill. And she was quite a trendy and well-dressed young lady who was buying her fashionable clothes from an online fashion house that was recently outed by the FDA or by the EPA as having 4 to 18 times the allowable heavy metal limit, lead, mercury, you name it, in their clothing and their accessories, which when I saw that, I just was like, are you kidding me? Even to this day, and especially with online purchasing, that we're just buying directly from overseas manufacturers who are manufacturing these products knowingly with high amounts of metal because, well, one, they don't have the restrictions in their country. And two, by having those metals, they can have things that last longer, that are more pliable, because there's properties to those toxic metals that are advantageous for certain applications. Of course, not a really good thing for our overall healthcare. Autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is huge because many times long-term chronic illness you can point your lens at an autoimmune problem that started with some type of trauma. And once again, an infection like Lyme disease or one of the other tick-borne illnesses, but especially Lyme, it is such a traumatic event for the immune system that it could turn on predispositions to autoimmune issues. So at our clinic, we try to screen everybody for an autoimmune condition. And if it looks a little fuzzy, we go into a much bigger deep dive, because that's one of those things that if you catch it early enough, you can maybe avoid some of those long-term biological agents that can be helpful and very helpful for keeping a person functional, but also then cause many issues down the road if you're on them. Looking to avoid those as much as possible. And of course, there's metabolic disease. I mean, in America, the obesity, the blood sugar issues are rampant and raging, and that type of chronic metabolic issue will perpetuate neuroinflammation and make it really difficult to get that brain back to where you want it to be. So with neuroinflammation, there you can see that there's this process, and with the process, you have the beginning of it is all inflammation. So if you have inflammation, you're starting the process of having some secondary issues. With inflammation, it can lead to cerebral vascular disease. Cerebral vascular disease is where you basically inflame the cells within the brain that are helping keep the brain happy with a blood-brain barrier and to help keeping it clean from being inflamed and or oxidized. Once you allow inflammation and oxidation stress into the brain, it's like throwing a bunch of salt on your automobile. It's just a matter of time that it starts rusting and not working right. So we look to avoid that as much as possible. After the pro-inflammation, you can see on the slide metabolic, and that goes back to how a human could rust from the inside out. And the two of the best analogies or two best ways of looking at that is, one, if your blood sugars are not in control, you're just rusting from the inside out, because all those blood sugars creates oxidative stress, it creates inflammation, and it perpetuates itself. And that in itself can cause the cerebral vascular diseases that can lead to chronic neuroinflammation. And of course, then what does that create? Creates depression, neurodegeneration, dementia, creates dysfunction in your neuroendocrine system. It makes you old, it makes you less functional. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we try to live as clean and healthy of a life as we can. And more importantly, when you get ill, you're looking for trying to treat it in a root cause fashion and as natural and healthy as possible. And if that's not possible, you do the most laser focused, targeted, aggressive treatment just so you can get around it. Once you get past acute activity, once you have metabolics, blood sugar, high cholesterol, lipid disorders, once that progresses, it leads into that chronic inflammatory state. And with chronic inflammation, it's only a matter of time till you get what you have, these chronic small vessel diseases. This is where you get the blood-brain becomes leaky. And all of a sudden, what's supposed to be kept out of the brain isn't always being kept out of it, because you got this leaky filter allowing things that don't belong in the brain to get in there. And that's, of course, when you talk about an infectious disease, you get something like a beryllium, a spirochete. If it is sly enough early on to get right into that brain, you have problems really fast. And that's where you're in the ER with a PICC line and some IV antibiotics, and you're praying that you live through the night. Likewise, you can have a state where you can have a chronic infection in the peripheral, circulating maybe not in the brain or the central nervous system, but it still creates the inflammation, and that inflammation in time just pokes holes in that blood-brain barrier, causing that secondary neuroinflammation, and of course, all the problems after that. This is a much more fancy way of showing kind of some of the players involved here. Now, I'm not going to deep dive in like in a Nova episode here to kind of detail all the key parts here, but most importantly, you have these microglia cells that are supposed to keep your brain clean. They're supposed to keep the house clean. And what happens is those become damaged with chronic inflammation. And most of that chronic inflammation is going to be cytokine driven. Little chemicals that your immune system releases to communicate with itself. But unfortunately, when there's an infection in the body and the immune system sees it, they're not talking, they're shouting at each other, and they're shouting nonstop until they kind of like start falling apart. a lot like my mom and dad are. May bless their souls. They like to scream at each other. And as a result, what do you get? You get neuronal dysfunction. You get premature death of neurons in the brain. That means you have less plasticity, you have less ability to actually maintain a clean house in that central nervous system. And then you get all those secondary effects. Now, not only the brain fog, but also neurological issues and the inability to manage or to modulate all the other systems that are downstream from the brain. Because ultimately, I always like to say the brain runs the show. If that thing is going south on you, you don't have much after that, because the body takes its cues from it. So I wanted to put a couple of little things I just want to highlight, because once again, I think it was quite a interesting learning experience, I think, for a lot of the world. When COVID came along, there was like all of a sudden a lot of virology and chemistry and medical terminology and processes that were becoming mainstream, which never were before. And the cytokine storms that unfortunately have taken so many people's lives from COVID are also, once again, nothing unique to just a COVID. I mean, COVID happened to be a virus that your body never seen before, so it goes a little crazy on it. But likewise, we have these vectors in our environment that our body does not like. Borrelia is one of the most immune stimulating substances to the human immune system on the planet. So when the human immune system sees either a Borrelia bacterium or fragments of it, it loses itself. It starts hyperacting and works in a situation which then, just like with a cytokine storm in COVID, you can't control it sometimes, and so it creates a life of its own. And when it comes to COVID and long hauling activity, here's a nice little recent publications from The Economist, and they were highlighting the slow path of recovery for a lot of their long haul COVID people in Britain. Now, interesting, this is Britain. Now, Britain and America, our overall health is pretty darn similar. Our health care is very different. But unfortunately, the Brits abuse their bodies as much as Americans do in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of good parallels on that. And with that, you can see, it is very normal for many people in the population to have all these different symptoms. When you look at them, it's like, oh yeah, it looks a lot like a post-Lyme syndrome also. Yeah, with the exception of some of the more unique things like loss of smell, loss of taste. But these are issues that happen acutely, and the average person is pretty common and very normal. And then after about 5 weeks, there's a big dissipation of them. But guess what? They're still extremely well persistent in the population, even after 12 weeks. And of course, as studies go longer and longer, they'll be looking at COVID 3 months, 9 months, 1 year, 2 year, and having a bigger sample plots to give us some better data. But these are, from the abdominal pain and diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, shortness of breath, all these things. Yeah, they happen acutely to many people, but then a good almost half of them, if not more than half, are persisting much longer. And once again, part of this is that, yeah, you have a condition and an issue, but it also is reflecting what your health status is right now. And of course, how does that affect you? Well, it takes people out of life. And you all know very much in the Lyme Society, that many people where they got ill and it took their finances, it took their family life, it might have taken their marriage. They got people get disowned by their families. They get their employer leaves them go, and they end up with they have their houseplants and their cats, maybe some dogs too. But this is a real thing. It's happening on a large scale with COVID, It's been happening in these endemic areas within our country and other parts of the world over the last 3 decades and or 4 decades in some places. And so this is something that, it's nice to hear that there's more attention put on it. I just really hope that there's real research dollars and some big thinkers that are thinking out of the box and not in just some patentable pharmaceutical process that are thinking about these things. Because in all reality, there's nothing new about infections and viruses causing problems in humans. It's just now it's become so obvious that, hey, this causes a lot of problems and it shakes up a lot of problems. How do we deal with it? Oh, wait, we have a modern medical world and a modern medical system that doesn't work with it, who doesn't even know how to even approach it. And right now, you have all these poor people just left in a lurch, hoping that they kind of find something. And of course, they grasp onto anything they find on the internet in some help. And sometimes they find good information, and sometimes they don't. And unfortunately, it's a for me it's sad because you know enough to maybe help more people. At the same time, everyone's a unique case, and everyone comes in with a different set of issues on the front end, which means on the back end they have problems. And another nice analogy on that is when after the last economic crisis, when we almost went through a depression, there was a big legislation passed to make all your big banks become more solvent, and they institutionalized stress testing into banking systems. So a bank now has to show that they're soluble even during high economic stressors. So they do these annual stress tests that the Treasury creates for them. Well, humans, we don't have as many stress tests that we jump into. Like, hey, let's have an immune stress test. Let's go into my friend's house who's full of mold. Let me breathe it in and see how I feel. No, we try to avoid those things because they're bad for you. But anytime that you are exposed to a stressor, an infectious disease, whether it be an acute Lyme case or a chronic Borrelia case, or maybe it's a Epstein-Barr or cytomegalovirus, whatever it may be that you're harboring, that becomes a chronic stress test. And you know what? Humans weren't made for chronic stress testing. Back in the good old days when we were hunted and eaten on a regular basis, if you were not faster than the animal trying to eat you, you'd be dead. We live a lot longer and we have a much more controlled environment, but the stress tests are all still there and they come at us. We have medicines that help us get through them. Things like COVID, things like Lyme disease, these are some obvious stressors that really ratchet up the cytokines and the neuroinflammation, activate a lot of secondary issues, and you can see there's a lot of problems. Now, once again, with the Lyme Association here, I know that you've had many different speakers talk on different topics, and one that comes up is chronic inflammatory response syndrome and mold exposures, because once again, there's so many people who might have had Lyme that had problems, then they get ill again. They think that it might be Lyme, but then they find out, oh no, their house is moldy, their basement's moldy, there's a leak in the wall, and they have all these unexplained issues, but it revolves around back to that also. And groups like yours have helped educate people about that, because guess what? It's not advertised on a regular basis that our homes get rather sick themselves and are a source of a lot of illness. It's almost like, just put your head in the sand. It's okay. It's not it's not a problem. It could be, but it's so rare. It's not rare. And in well-constructed homes in multi-weather environments, like in Minnesota, it happens on a regular basis. And you can see even with mold disease, the chronic inflammatory response from mold often can replicate. It has its own unique features like the metallic taste, etc. But it often replicates in what looks like a neuro Lyme disease. It looks like a almost like it could be a long haul COVID case, because once again, there's unique features in the immune system and how something like mold reacts to the body, but there's commonalities of chronic inflammation and the neuroinflammatory response that occurs from that. And even with gut symptoms, my clinic in Stillwater, we have not only a breath analyzer that we use with our patients, but we have an in-house lab that services over 400 doctors and hospitals around the country for doing breath testing for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Why? Well, because we are a big GI tract filled with a bunch of bacteria. And if you normally have like 3 pounds of bacteria living in your gut, but you decide to have 4, 5, or 6 pounds, there becomes problems. And those problems likewise become chronic issues with a lot of metabolic changes and a lot of inflammation and immune upregulation, which then causes neuroinflammation. And so you see all these other secondary problems. Once again, some of them more unique, like a fatty liver or gallstones, but then other things that are kind of universal with other illnesses. Post Lyme disease, you can see that there's a dramatic multi-system breakdown that occurs with individuals. And once again, all these post-Lyme disorders, things that are identified as secondary to chronic inflammatory dysregulation, that then results. And are these because of an active infection? Is it because of a hyperimmune state? Is it because of a dysregulatory state that has fed from multiple different parts, from metabolics to your environment, that collide together and then given a big boost because of a Lyme attack? In addition to that, one of the things to also identify is that it's now become more accepted that not only is the inflammation from the acute Lyme disease that's a problem, but it's the dead fragmented parts of Borrelia that can linger on long term. And of course, if you're someone with chronic or persistent Lyme and you keep making bacteria that creates these dead remnant parts, you perpetuate this chronic inflammatory spot. Your body actually can create a huge amount of neuroinflammation from the dead remnants of Lyme bacterium, the Borrelia, and it eventually could lead to not only the inflammatory state, it also then perpetuates early cell death, and so you get the degeneration. A lot of neurodegenerative issues may be the cause of this. It's becoming more and more popular or talked about how secondary or the chronic infections that we have, whether it be the bacteria in our mouth with dental caries, to old cases of herpes or chlamydia, causing long-term inflammation and then changes within our vasculature in our brain, leading to dementia. And so it's interesting that in this realm of extreme amount of money spent on dementia in research, everyone for the longest time just kept looking and saying, hey, we need to get rid of those plaques in the brain and we'll cure dementia. And finally, after billions of dollars and decades of research, people are turning around and saying, well, you know, we have meds that take care of some plaques now, but it hasn't changed the disease state, because guess what? There's something that causes the disease state that's actually the problem. And oftentimes things that we first look at that are obvious symptoms or obvious changes aren't really the primary problem. They're more secondary. In a case with Lyme disease, you know, the idea that you have an active living infection causing problem is one of them, and that can definitely be the case. Secondary is that, hey, guess what? Those dead fragments that could also stick around a long time, those cause just as much problem or can cause as much problem. And that's why there's such a universal persistent post-Lyme disease that's seen throughout the population. And of course, just like with anything else in a population, there's a bell-shaped curve. And there's going to be a subset that actually are going to have a significant longer recovery rate based on something that other people might get over really quickly. And of course, that goes into other factors of neuroinflammation and other conditions, and of course, other things on top of that. And going back to the idea that, when you get a case of Lyme disease, it's like getting hit by a linebacker in the NFL. It's like having your head smashed against the wall sometimes, because that neural inflammation and the changes that stem from that on a PET scan, they look like a concussion. And nowadays, people have probably known someone that might have gone to an aiming clinic and got a PET scan, and they say, look, you got these changes. It looks like a chronic infection. And then, they might find something there. It's an expensive and not a very diagnostic, approach to doing it. But, if you have the equipment and you're testing everyone, it is something that you'll see on a regular basis. Interestingly, a lot of the Lyme disease PET scans also can have a shred that looks a lot like a carbon monoxide poisoning also in some patients, highlighting how significant the inflammatory and of course the degeneration could occur with that condition. And I found this particular, when I was looking around for different images and different ways to help kind of like represent the neuroinflammation. I even found one on fibromyalgia. Now, fibromyalgia to me is just a garbage can term. It's not a disease, like, oh, I got bit by the fibromyalgia bug. Fibromyalgia is the symptom, but on top of that, though, it's interesting, and researchers have found some consistently similar neuroinflammatory areas within the brain that they've also found in PET scans. So once again, neuroinflammation causing a lot of conditions that often all melt together with these multi-system, multi-symptom type of manifestations. In addition to that, of course, in a more simple illustration, when you have those chronic inflammatory states, you can see how it can affect every part of your body and your own personality and how you perceive your environment. You can have difficulty with your memories, word finding, problems with falling asleep at night, which then perpetuates a lot of problems because you're not repairing your brain with growth hormone if you don't have quality sleep. It stimulates a lot of the prefrontal cortex, so you get more paranoid thoughts, more anxiety, more insomnia. You get the hallucinations possibly when it's getting really bad. Obviously, a lot of visual disturbances. And of course, in Lyme disease, there's visual acuity tests that you can do to track and to help identify whether or not you're improving some of the neuroinflammation. In addition to that, with my patients, I often refer them to one of the vision therapy optometry groups here in Minnesota. There's a couple different chains of optometrists that have vision therapy facilities. They're used a lot of times for children with reading disorders, dyslexia. They have great research on how they improve concussions. And so my concussion patients, I always send to them. And guess who else I send to them? I send my Lyme patients that have neuroinflammation. I also send my long haul COVID patients with neuroinflammation, because once again, by helping vision, especially motor vision changes, you're able to help behind that the brain and help it reestablish proper circuitry so that you don't perpetuate some of the, not only the symptoms, but also it helps reduce some of the inflammation because you're not stressing out those neurons anymore. In addition to that, once again, in my clinic, we see a lot of people with gut issues. And one of those reasons that we see a lot of people with gut issues is that when you have a chronic gut infection, whether it be something like a protozoan or some other type of parasite, whether it be an overgrowth of like Clostridium difficile or C. diff, or it's something like a perpetuation of like an overgrowth of your normal bacteria, like a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. When you have a large group of bacteria or other harmful pathogens residing in your gut, that gut bacteria causes a change in your immune system. It leads to breakdowns in your protective intestinal barrier, like your tight cell junctions, your mucus layer, etc. And what the result of that is an upregulated immune system. And don't forget, the largest immune organ in your body is your intestines. And when those are upregulated, they create a number of known cytokines, which are the same cytokines released in an acute infection like Lyme disease or COVID. Your interferon gamma, your tumor necrosis factor alpha, your interleukin 6, all of those cause then more of a chronic circle of dysfunction. It leads to the inflammation, leads to tight junction disrepair and dysfunction, leading to more permeability, leading to more immune upregulation, and this vicious cycle. And of course, if your intestinal barriers are not healthy, it perpetuates the dysbiosis. So your weeds in the garden grow more. And of course, evolutionary wise, just like Borrelia trying to hide in anything it can screw itself into to avoid the immune system, the bacteria or the protozoans or the amoebas in your gut, whether it be the small or the large intestine, they're buried into the mucosal lining. They're hiding in tissues to try and avoid detection because they don't want to get washed out or destroyed either. And so when you're looking at helping people with basic metabolic disorders, with chronic inflammatory issues, it's hard to even get anywhere if their gut's not healthy and happy on the front end, because your job is much harder and more difficult. It also creates a lot of confusion, because you may prescribe certain symptoms with one condition, but you have another one causing the same, and in time it becomes worse. And that we see a lot of times with the gut, because as I mentioned before, hey, it's pretty normal to have 2 or 3 pounds of bacteria in your gut. But when you have 4 pounds of bacteria, you're overwhelming the system and you're creating a lot of chronic inflammatory stress and metabolic dysfunction. And of course, you have the idea also that you have antibiotics and other therapies to help with different conditions that could also perpetuate and cause some of the same irregularities in the gut dysbiosis and in the gut immune activation that then actually perpetuates it. And of course, that also goes into the why you need a healthy, happy gut, because that's what helps keep your largest immune organ happy and in homeostasis. One of the things I did a presentation for the National Naturopathic Association at one point in time, and they had asked me about lab testing, and so I did a lab testing review with them. And one of the things I highlighted was, because one of the things that occurs quite a bit is the use of testing for good reasons. But if a doctor doesn't interpret right, they can be misinterpreted, and then you're going down the wrong hole sometimes. And it's always interesting because in your conventional Western blot test that you get at like your national laboratory or hospitals, et cetera, the FDA approved or CDC approved Lyme test, when that particular test, it doesn't have a huge number of markers. But even with those markers, you have certain ones that pop up all the time. And you'll hear I hear primary care doctors all the time, like, oh yeah, the P41 came up. Yeah, it always comes up and it's no big deal. Everyone has it. Well, one, not everyone has it. And two, if your P41 goes up, that's a marker on a Western blot test. that is a non-specific Lyme marker, but it indicates bacterial overload. It indicates a high amount of bacterial flagellum, the little motility protein agent within the bacteria, microfilament, I should say, not protein, but microfilament. And but yet it comes up all the time. And it's like, well, if you have like a sinus infection, if you have a gut overgrowth in such a large amount that it actually triggers a Lyme marker to go high, maybe it's significant to your health. Call me crazy. In addition to that, typically, you can have a moderate amount of bacterial overgrowth and have a P41 jump up on a test, an IgM or an IgG. But it's the real severe ones, and I've seen them many times before, where you have, a good 50, 100%, 200% more bacteria than you really should have in that gut. And there's some neuropathies maybe stemming from that. And as a side effect, not only does the non-specific marker like a P41 bacterium go up, but then your heat shock proteins, the proteins that are designed to identify if there's a stressor to the immune system, a major stressor, those can come up, and they becoming more like a false positive. Kind of hard to have the conventional lab tests be a false positive with just a gut dysbiosis. Pretty rare, because unfortunately, those tests are calibrated so that they're not horribly super sensitive. So they try to be more specific. So the way that they created that test for acute Lyme disease, not for something more persistent or long lasting, like a chronic or even in this case, like a Lyme, like a SIBO. But on top of that, if you use a lab developed test, so a test that's not a CDC approved test, which I'm not here promoting a CDC approved test, but I'm just highlighting the fact that, CDC tests, it's like a radio that has the volume turned down so that, no one really hears it too much and doesn't falsely make too much noise. Well, a lot of lab developed tests, well, that volume's up really, really high, and it's pretty, it can find a lot of things. You could hear it from far away. Likewise, when that happens, not only can you get like the obvious P41 bacterium that comes up positive, but then you have all these other non-specific Lyme proteins. Yeah, some of them are proteins that they took from Borrelia, but they're universally shared with other bacteria or other actions. So yeah, these membrane lipoproteins, flagellum remnants, heat shock proteins. And with that, you get a lot of false positives if you got a big colony of bacteria around. And that just goes to highlight, it's like, all right, well, if you're going to be doing a Lyme test, well, make sure you don't have some other infection going on, because if you're using a lab developed test that's designed to be hypersensitive, you will get a lot of false positives on these less than specific markers because they're universally shared with other bacteria. And we see that sometimes in the sinuses. We see that a lot with the gut because there's a lot of bacteria in there. They create a lot of byproducts and a lot of bacterial residue. And that's where, if you got too many weeds in your gut, you're not going to be able to see the rest of the garden. And that's where it gets confusing, because yeah, there might be something in the background. You can't tell because there's too much of a mess. And that's why you want to at least strategically splice out, tackle a problem, move on forward. And then especially in difficult cases, you become a little bit smarter on identifying the plant behind all the weeds once you clear out some of the weeds. So in the big picture, when it comes to like something like chronic illness and neuroinflammation, the holistic approach is really the only way. Now, there's an old saying that, hey, all you have to do is drop out of society, go up to the mountaintop, meditate, live a sentient life, and you'll heal yourself. And you know what? I've been in those environments and I've seen people that have done that, and they started off with some real ill health, and over decades, they become better. It's a very long-term process. And yeah, not everyone wants to drop out of society. Not everyone wants to just devote all their time to healing. And a lot of people want to live a normal, as normal of a life or as happy of life as they possibly can. So a truly holistic approach, eating nothing but nuts and berries and meditating all day, sure, that can help a lot of people. That's not realistic for everyone, and that's why we use a lot of tools to help people with that. Big picture wise, if you want to help reduce the trauma to the brain, we all know on the front end, you got to have a healthy living. If you don't have healthy living, you are not going to reverse things very easily. You still can, but it's just more difficult. So if you have neural inflammation, if you have a chronic disease affecting your neural circuitry, causing metabolic issues, you're going to have to pull away some of those things some of those vices that you might like, alcohol, drugs, smoking, things on that. Or I think I'm preaching to the choir in regards to the healthy living. Likewise, there's a lot of things that you can help with healing people, and go figure, the most beneficial things you can do is take in healthy healing food, because healthy healing food, we're just a big old car driving through this world, in this universe, in this dimension. But what gas you put in will indicate a lot about how far you go and how well you drive. And the more healthy the healthier the food you put in, the more phytochemicals that are antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, the beneficial it'll be. It's more beneficial for you. On top of that, there's a lot of things that you can approach with patients. You can approach with your doctors to try and help pull out the little pieces. And you know what? There's no one way of doing this. Any doctor, any company that says, hey, I've got a 5-part program that will cure all your problems, well, run for the hills. That doesn't exist. Everyone's individual and everyone's unique. Let me think. Ooh. Are you still there?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay.
I think you took your screen share off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for letting me know. Let me
Yeah,
go.
absolutely.
Someone was drawing on my screen. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. So there's a lot of different ways that you could approach this. And so there's no one way. And so I just wanted to share a few things because, I thought this would be a little more conversational, because, one thing about a medical practice is that you don't know everything. That's why they call it practice. You live on this earth, you learn new things, you learn some old things that become new things. You tend to forget more things that you know, and then you realize, wow, I used to know a lot more than I know now. And of course, you come in contact with all these different people with different views, different educations, different life experiences, and they kind of enrich you a little bit. And of course, our patients are great feedbacks, because a lot of our patients, which I'm very grateful for, they share what helps them. And I've gotten people where it's like, hey, you really helped me a little bit, but I went and did this and got a lot better. I'm like, oh, well, I'm glad that you circled back to me, because I now can help someone else with that in that same situation. So of course, some of the most basic things is where I just let people know. I mean, if you're working with a practitioner, I mean, every practitioner has different assessments. Now, I'm not talking about the energy healers. I'm not talking about people that do different types of therapies that may not be kind of like in the medical kingdom with medical testing. This is more in the medical testing conversation. So I'm not being all encompassed. This is just things that I look at doing with people and that I find valuable. And just to be aware that, there's things that you can, that might be out there that you might not know. Obviously, just basic assessing people on a regular basis for their metabolics, their blood sugars, their cardiovascular lipids, their overall health, their electrolytes, and of course, inflammatory markers. Because if you have chronic inflammation, some chronic inflammation doesn't show up on your conventional tests, and a lot of the non-conventional tests, like if you're measuring cytokines directly, that's kind of a bogus test. It's a here and now test. Someone was selling a bunch of them during COVID. I was part of a lab that tried to bring cytokine testing to the market, and cytokine testing is really a research thing to look in a controlled environment. And when you use it in clinical practice, it really just reaffirms what you sort of know. Hey, this person has inflammation, or this person has autoimmune disease. It doesn't tell you much more than that, unfortunately, but the testing can be really expensive. But you could have things that are more conventional markers, like not only your C-reactive protein, but you can look for your fibrinogen. You could also look for some less than obvious markers, like your inflammation of your blood vessels, your plaque 2, or your myeloperoxidase measurements used for cardiovascular measurements. But the myeloperoxidase is also a nice measurement for gut health. Autoimmunity. So what drives me a little crazy is that many patients, they get the basic autoimmune screens. So they get they get their anti-nuclear antibody test. They might get an RF factor test. And that's pretty much about it. Maybe a CP3, CPP. I mean, I don't know, but it doesn't go a really deep dive. There are specialty lab tests, even in the conventional world, that open up the door. One lab is called Advice Labs out of Chicago area. They're a conventional laboratory for rheumatologists, but unfortunately, they're too trendy and cool for the average rheumatologist. So they tend to bring some more of the early adopters, offering some additional testing for autoimmune to look for predictive markers of severity or aggressiveness, ways to also look for like other conditions that often go unnoticed, like a phospholipid syndromes. And so these are tests that are available, covered by most every insurance, and still very poorly done. So unfortunately, I do diagnose a lot of chronic ill patients still with autoimmune diseases that just, no one ever cared to look for. And that really drives me crazy because, unfortunately, autoimmune disease is a long-term problem. The sooner you manage it, the better things are. So it's nice to help identify that, at least screen things through where appropriately. On the hormones, there's more than just sex hormones out there, and there's more to thyroid than just TSH and T4. So having one of the things that people need to advocate even more for is testing autoimmune activity of your thyroid. Autoimmune thyroiditis is the most common autoimmune disease in the world. And it's probably the most underdiagnosed, because in conventional medicine, in the insurance model, you have to be ill enough to have a altered TSH or in order to actually probably get more of a screen. And then they only measure your antibodies once in your life and never again, because for some reason, the autoimmune inflammatory response and the headwind that hits your metabolics from that activity doesn't factor into how you dose or manage a patient. And once again, that leads to a lot of patients having a downregulated metabolism, which then sets you up for so many issues with neuroinflammation and post-infectious recovery. In addition to that, sex hormones. So I'll be honest with you, for most of my career, I try to avoid measuring any sex hormones because I didn't want to go into bioidentical hormones. I didn't want to tell women that after God puts you through menopause, that all of a sudden you're better off with hormones. I considered that a lazy approach to a medicine. I thought doctors that just focused on that were just kind of shortchanging a lot of their patients, which they still do sometimes if that's what their focus is. But one thing that I was reminded by a practitioner out of the Austin, Texas area. She was an OBGYN, 35th year in practice when I met with her. And she basically said, well, all right, well, you know that, most animals on this planet never go through menopause. And I'm like, yep, I got my zoology degree, and I happen to know that there's a handful of porpoises, including the killer whale, that they go through menopause. But outside porpoises, not animals don't go through menopause because their ability to reproduce is consistent from cradle to grave. But humans don't. But once again, maybe 5,000 years ago, how many women went through menopause? Not many, because the average age was about 27. And as our population, as our society has changed fundamentally from being part of nature to living on the planet and having it serve us, everything has changed, including how long we live. Now, women could live as long in menopause as they do out of menopause. And your sex hormones, especially your estradiol, if you're not susceptible to breast cancer, if it's not something that plagues your family tree, it's a valuable thing that you can do in a very low dose. You don't need to do high doses. It doesn't have to be expensive. You could do low dose bioidentical hormones, and the neuroprotective and regenerative properties that they provide are rather significant. And when in some cases, when you have a patient who is so sensitive to so many things, hypersensitive to medications, to herbs, who has a hard time stabilizing, sometimes a hormone approach actually helps provide that first step into the right direction of self-repair, because you're able to stabilize at least one system. And then as a secondary benefit, hormones like estradiol have such a huge positive effect on the nervous system to help it keep it more viable and dynamic and repairable. In addition to that, there's also things like growth hormone. No one should give growth hormone directly, but there's ways to actually do it indirectly. And those have benefits too when you're not healing properly. Gross nutrient reviews. I mean, just do the basics. Iron deficiency is still a major issue. And I've heard it many times from a lot of my chronic Lyme patients where they're like, yeah, I know I'm anemic, but I was told not to take iron because it feeds bacteria. And that's when you go, all right, well, that is true. A lot of bacteria like iron. But if you don't have iron, you don't carry oxygen in your blood. And that's not an overrated thing. You have to have a certain level of iron and ferritin in your body so that you transport oxygen so you are healthy. You don't stay anemic out of the fear that it might cause a secondary issue. Iron's part of our world, and you need a certain amount. And yes, chronic inflammatory states can cause anemia by preventing the storage of ferritin. Conversely, there's some patients that we also find that have hemochromatosis, and they actually have a excessive amount of ferritin. And that's one of those other causes where your body can rust from the inside out. Having too much iron circulating and too much ferritin in your tissues can lead to a huge amount of oxidative stress. And the secondary issues include a huge amount of brain fog and neuropathies in a lot of these patients. So a very critical thing in that. But measuring someone's B12 and folate, that's a nice thing to do in the serum. For the average American, it means nothing because, well, guess what? You have nutrition in your food and you're going to have B12 and folate in your serum. The trick is does it get into your blood cells? And that's why you need to have a homocysteine measurement on a regular basis. And if you're working with a conventional doctor with Medicare or a conventional insurance, they won't give that to you. So you need to advocate for yourself. And they're like, well, why do I need to test your homocysteine? Because I want to make sure that I'm absorbing my B12 and folate. And likewise, if you've never measured it before, you don't know, because you can have some chronic or some genetic mutations that are also very common that can put you behind the 8 ball and lead you to having lower amounts of active folate in the body. And of course, vitamin D is, well, we live in Minnesota and Wisconsin in the upper Midwest. So, 80% of the people are going to be low in vitamin D and need to supplement with it during your winter and fall months. Allergy assessments. To this date, I mean, one of the things that really over the last 7 years that have really helped a lot of clinicians is realizing a condition of having an excessive amount of histamine, whether it be a mast cell activation syndrome or just a high histamine because of immune upregulation. And of course, a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it can be secondary to allergy activity. And allergists are, maybe not the most, let's just say conventional allergists do a good job some of the time. And it would be great if they did a great job all the time. And you'd have to be a little more dynamic in your testing and your perception of how the immune system works and where it operates in the body in order to maybe get to the next level. And with allergy assessments, I mean, we're stuck with some poor choices between skin prick tests, serum IgE testing, but there's other testing that's now available or been available. It's a little bit less common, but there's IgG4, IgG, there's a complement factor, which also gives you other snapshots into your immune system, which are unique little pictures into the immune activity. And those are very valid to do. In addition to the fact that there's a lot of people with environmental allergies, and the less healthy we are, the more those allergies are becoming rampant and troublesome. And histamine is locally something that causes inflammation and redness, makes your nose drip, your eyes itch. In your bloodstream, histamine is a stimulatory neurotransmitter as potent as adrenaline, and something that often predisposes people to the anxiety, the insomnia that comes along with a chronically upregulated immune system. And it will lead to more blood-brain barrier issues and more neural inflammation in time. And so it's something that is something that you can manage sometimes a little bit better. And sometimes the only thing you have you do the best you can with managing it, then you try to desensitize from it and then maybe modulate your immune system so you're not as infective as allergic. And of course, there's infectious disease testing. Once again, your group gets lectured to, I think, on a regular basis about all the different types of tests, et cetera. I happen to come from a viewpoint where I worked in the lab industry, and I'd like to always, my little thing that I say is that I've seen the good and the bad and the ugly of it. So I've seen, I unfortunately know enough of the people that own labs within the alternative space to know that there's some that stick to good science. There's some that are really in there for profit making. And the way that the laws are written for regulating laboratories, it's a wild, wild west. And the vast majority of lab tests that you are offered now are what they call lab developed testing. And the validation requirements to bring one to market is a very small hoop to jump through. You only need to prove for 100, 200, or 300 samples that you could run them properly. And guess who creates the test, who has the answer key, and who supplies all the materials? Yeah, the lab. So if they can't run their own lab with their own answer key correctly, that's kind of a hard one to do. And in that, once they validate it, which once again, as long as you have the money, it's an easy thing to validate, you can advertise it for anything. So you can say it's an autism test, a Lyme test. You name the test, they can run it and advertise it because there's no restrictions. And that's something that unfortunately it's a double-edged sword. It helps with innovation. It helps create new testing because it lowers the barrier to bring tests to market. It can create some innovations and some hypersensitivities that can be very helpful. At the same time, there's a lot of false positives. There's a lot of bad testing out there because in all reality, you don't have to prove that it actually has any benefit. You just have to prove that you could run it. That's kind of a little ass backwards in my book. I think you really should be able to validate that it's effective, just like a medication should be brought to market, validating honestly all the good and bad it does, and prove that it's actually a little bit, or have some type of a assessment to show that it actually is monetarily a better option than something old and traditional that's available. GI tract assessments, we do obviously a lot of breath testing because we have a breath lab. At the same time, we do a lot of stool testing and a lot of blood tests also. And once again, with the stool test, you sometimes you find a lot of individuals with persistent chronic protozoan issues that often perpetuate a lot of chronic Lyme. And of course, those protozoans, those are the ones that they measure. There may be other things in there. And I can guarantee you we keep finding in our nature's jungles and forests, new species, even to this date, with 8 billion people now on this planet. In your gut, yeah, we're going to keep finding new things. And of course, once again, parasites, they hide from the immune system. They're designed to not get washed out so they can keep and replicating. So there's a lot more things that are going bump in the night in our colons than we really want to think about. And they don't have to be the gross horde story things. They're often one cell creatures that are just kind of creating a bad garden soil, which then perpetuates a lot of weeds in the garden. And then there's neurological testing. I do a lot of psychotropic genetic analysis to look for some root causes on why certain people have mood disorders and other psychiatric issues as side effects to oftentimes chronic inflammation. These things often, when you're younger, it doesn't really eke its ugly head out. But as we get older, as we get more hormones in our adolescence and then young adulthood, or later on when we have a career and you're burnt out, and you have your nervous breakdown, and all of a sudden, hey, look, I had all these issues that predisposed me. Oh, and of course, half of us know it because we have family members, and we can kind of look and go, yeah, I'm a little bit like that one. I'm a lot like that one. And you can see where that might be taking you. Think about that on your Thanksgiving Day dinner events. Urinary neurotransmitters. I work for the lab that helped pioneer doing urinary transmitter testing in the clinical setting. I still do some. I don't do a huge amount, but I do quite a bit because it's still a nice pulse point to know where someone's idling. And of course, with a lot of disease states, early in the disease state, you get a lot of neurotransmitters released to help upregulate the immune system. And of course, when what goes up comes down, in time, when your nervous system has a pedal to the metal, it burns its brakes out, and then you're left in this poor process to help regulate itself. And then you also do urinary cryptopyloria tests. And I do that every so often. I used to do that a little more infrequently because pylorias in the urine are associated more with autism and with spectral disorders and with schizophrenia. But I keep finding more and more patients that have a cryptopyloria elevated in as a sequela of some type of acute case. And whether or not these maintain elevated long term, I'm not 100% sure. Most of them, when you have them, they're a long-term issue, which would indicate a pylorrhea disease. And pylorrhea leads to a lot of nervous system imbalances where stressors throw your whole body off kilter. I won't go into whole detail on that, but it's a low cost urine test. It's available through Quest Diagnostics in your national labs. It's available through good labs that have been around for a long time pioneering it. And then there's approaches. And this goes back to approaches. There's so many different things that people do. There's no one way to heal someone. Like I said, we could all just give up everything we want to do, eat nothing but good organic sentient foods, meditate, pray, do social service, and maybe we'll heal ourselves. At the same time, if that's not working for you as plan A, there's a lot of other therapies out there. One of the keys with post-COVID syndrome, and one of the keys with concussion syndromes or traumatic brain injuries or with any type of neuroinflammation, a very simple, very natural first thing is you want high doses of a fat-soluble anti-inflammatory antioxidant. And when I say high doses, if you want it in the brain, it's going to have to be a high dose. And one of the best fats to get across the blood-brain barrier and to get absorbed is going to be your omega-3 fatty acids. Fish oil is where most people get that from, but you can get it from krill or algae if you want to spend more money. But in all reality, the compound of a EPA, DHA, omega-3 fatty acid is healing on itself and creates a great carrier, just like a carrier oil to help get more things in the brain. So if you want to bring another fat soluble herb or botanical or anti-inflammatory, you use a high dose of fish oil with it. So when I say high dose of fish oil, our post-COVID protocols, our concussion protocols, they all start off with like 3 grams of fish oil 3 times a day with food. That's a high dose. You do it for a week, but then you taper down to 2 grams 3 times a day, and then to 1 gram 3 times a day. But then you might reverse back up because, hey, I felt, I had less symptoms. I felt better at a higher dose. And you always, in what I do, and of course everyone can be a little bit different, but you could. I use a fat soluble form of curcumin, turmeric root, and a very good anti-inflammatory on its own. It's poorly absorbed through the gut. So if you buy just your regular curcumin, well, that's good for your gut inflammation, but it's not going to get to your brain very well. So there's different forms out there. You don't have to be. I don't think spending a lot of money on curcumin is a wise thing because it's rather inexpensive to begin with. And if you get something that's phytosomed or fat soluble, then you can use it with your fish oil, and then you get a synergistic effect. And the research on combining your fish oil or curcumin is well known to have substantially greater antioxidant, anti-inflammatory properties. Other oils that are good, I love black seed oil. We did a research study for a Israeli raw material manufacturer who made black seed oil, and we did it for people with hypertension. And we had a substantial, 80% of the people had a reduction in blood pressure taking it, because once again, it's a very potent anti-inflammatory antioxidant, and it's fat soluble. Now, it's not great tasting, and it's more expensive than fish oil. So cost wise and for dosing wise, I still think fish oil is great. But there's also research showing that if you add black seed oil, from curcumin, take black seed oil and add it to your fish oil, it's synergistic. It just like curcumin was, it makes it work better than the separates each individually. So that's a really simple thing that people can do. And honestly, I was pretty floored away when we have all these post-COVID syndromes coming in, and you just I put everybody who came in with those type of symptoms, with neuroinflammation, a lot of your long hauler conditions, on a protocol like that. It helps rebound them really quickly. Once again, some people, they need to take it longer term because for X, Y, and Z purposes, their neuroinflammation is more perpetual. And so just like with your chronic Lyme, so just like your chronic inflammatory response syndrome or for mold, etc. We do nutritional IVs. Once again, Getting your immune system boosted and more regulated is a good thing. A something you don't have to do monster high doses of IV nutrition to have benefits. In all reality, I mean, super high doses of things like vitamin C, great if you're trying to destroy a tumor. Really bad idea if you've got a bunch of neuroinflammation, because really high levels of vitamin C, like a 50-gram vitamin C IV, they're going to cause more reactive oxygen species, because at a certain point in time, you become more of an oxidative stressor with vitamin C than an antioxidant. So keeping between 10 and 20 grams on a vitamin C is fine to do, and you don't need to be upsold to a higher dose. And having some trace vitamins in there is good. Your benefits with a lot of your hydration or your IVs is going to be the hydration part of it, a lactated ringer or a normal saline, especially if you're someone who's got like a high histamine state, mast cell flare-ups. By diluting the blood, you dilute the histamine in the mast cells and you feel a little better. I do like adding in 10 grams of vitamin C, both in patients suffering from post-viral diseases, as a maintenance for people who are slugging through more of a persistent Lyme. If you are on highly oxidative therapies like a vitamin, like antibiotics, having a little additional antioxidant support can help reduce the side effects and the oxidative damage, and help repair some of the blood-brain barrier damage from those therapies, and that's not a bad thing. There's a lot of there's some other designer IVs out there that get a lot of press, but for a lot of the chronically ill, it's sort of a waste of money. I've been doing IVs with patients for 22 years, and I've seen a lot of fads come and go. And ultimately, a lot of times there's a handful of really good go-tos between the vitamin C, your B vitamins, your trace minerals. Glutathione pushes can help in certain situations. They definitely help with detoxing and people with mold exposures for sure. I'm always surprised that people get more benefit out of glutathione than they do, because it doesn't stick around the blood very long, but it has some valuable aspects. When you have some of the chronic illnesses, a chronically upregulated immune system, and we see a lot of mast cell issues, a lot of high histamine issues. And as I mentioned to many my patients, the mast cell issue, the high histamine state, is rarely your primary cause. It's always going to be secondary to an upregulated immune system, which implies automatically, if it's upregulated enough to create the mast cell issue, you got some neuroinflammation and some blood-brain barrier leakage going on as a secondary issue. And you might use anywhere from the natural to prescriptive mast cell stabilizers to your antihistamines. And of course, as healthy living as you possibly can. But once again, a lot of times those are band-aids until you get the root causes. Hormone support can be a big part of that. I mentioned that earlier before. Still such a critical thing that often, if someone doesn't do hormones, they don't look for it. It's just nice to look for it, even if they don't do anything with it, just to make sure you don't have that as a problem. Detox support. There's so many people that have so many opinions on detox support. The idea, though, is that if you are in a chronic inflammatory state, there are a number of things your own body down-regulates in that process. And not having enough B12 and folate, not having enough glutathione production, often puts you behind the 8 ball in trying to get into the game. Likewise, basic things like liver health. If you have a gut full of bacteria, the chance of it causing more of sluggish bile, which is key and highly important in detoxification, will be compromised. Your ability to detoxify and metabolize your hormones, your estrogens, especially, critical aspect of the liver. That's often the first thing that goes by the wayside when you're challenged. And these are all little things that you can do. Immune modulators are really important. They can be immune modulators simplistically, like, like a curcumin. You could be a little more advanced, like a Moducare, a nutritional supplement of different plant sterols that have been shown to be helpful with autoimmune thyroiditis, to things like low dose naltrexone, or even antibiotics. And we've known that like things like minocycline can help downregulate the immune system, used in research for rheumatoid arthritis. But now there's actually been people investigating, researching on whether or not, things like doxycycline, where you do multiple rounds of doxycycline and you kind of help your tachycardia, you help calm the nervous system down. Well, is it because it was killing something, or was it actually a mast cell stabilizer or an immune modulator helping with that? And those are important questions to ask, because no one should be taking antibiotics all the time unless they need them. And if you need them, well, then you should be taking them. But don't be taking them like candy, because there's a perceived benefit. Now, obviously, if it's your benefit, that's a different story. But it opens up the big intellectual question of, well, why? Because if it's helping, how could I help all the time without having all the bad side effects of it? And then lastly, in my practice, the newest thing that I started experimenting with, and hey, when you bring something new into the clinic, it's truly an experiment. So we're now using peptide therapies with patients. I put a couple of slides in for what that means. I think in the Lyme community, they're starting to get more press and talking about BPC 157. BPC 157 is wait, I'll back up. A peptide. Peptide's a prescriptive medication. There are peptides that you could buy online also. Whether or not they have anything in them, I don't know. They're considered, as a doctor, I would never buy a medication offline or online and then take it, but a lot of people do. That's actually where most peptides are sold. But there are lots of compounding pharmacies that also have prescriptive peptides. A peptide just means it's an amino acid chain, and it's smaller than 50 peptides. The old definition before COVID, it was actually smaller than 100 peptides. But somewhere in COVID, after a couple of the peptides became really popular at supporting immune system health, for some reason, after 85 years of the definition, they redefined it, and then it eliminated a lot of those products that were on the market. So now peptide is 50 or less amino acid chains. The most popular peptide in medicine is something called insulin. So insulin's a peptide, which then helps a lot of people with their blood sugar support. BPC 157 is a peptide originally harvested. They found it in the stomach, and they were purposely looking for a peptide in the stomach because the stomach regenerates its tissue faster than any other organ in the body because of all the erosion of the acid. And so after they discovered it, they also discovered it everywhere. So anytime you have an injury somewhere, your body kind of secretes this like BPC 157 into an area to help stimulate healing. And so with that, people use it as an injection. I happen to had a wonderful experience this last summer. I was water skiing, which I don't do very often. And I'll tell you right now, I'll never water ski again, because I detached my left hamstring and ended up doing a long recovery from that. BPC 157 was one of the early research studies, and one of the biggest applications is to help stimulate the rehealing of a muscle or tendon or ligament injury. And so, yeah, so I was very grateful for having the ability to have that and then use it very precisely for my injury. We use it, you could use it systemically, like an injection for blood-brain barrier support. You could use it orally to help with gut healing, been shown in research to help with a lot of gastrointestinal healing issues. So it's nice that it's found in multiple different forms. There's also things that you could use as a peptide. And the reason why I like peptides right now is because with peptides, you don't have to wonder if it's helping. It's like taking insulin. If you take insulin, it's going to help in managing your blood sugar. if you're taking BPC 157, it's going to help heal something if you have something injured. In the case of other peptides, like the CJC 1295, meprelin, that one helps in boosting growth hormone production. And a lot of individuals with chronic disease, a lot of individuals who might have gotten over some chronic disease, who just can't reboot themselves, one of the problems is that their bodies have down-regulated growth hormone production. Your sleep has been so bad over the years that you don't make enough. Whatever it may be, by boosting growth hormone activity, you're able to kind of like reverse the clock a little bit. There's so many secondary benefits. Every cell in your body likes growth hormone to help in repairing. So you can improve your bone density, help with tissue healing, help with sleep quality, cognitive functions, etc. It's not one of those things that, you know, for the longest time, you think of growth hormone, you just think of bodybuilders and anti-aging aficionados. But once again, if you have a really debilitating illness or you're trying to get to the next level of health and you just can't turn that corner, it becomes another tool in the tool bag, and it has, you know, it has such a upside and such a limited downside that it becomes a useful tool, including something like a delta sleep inducing peptide. Yeah, they actually made something like that that helps in helping improve neurotransmitter activity in the brain, and could help in reinvigorating a lot of those altered circadian patterns to help kind of boost your dopamine, serotonin, and GABAergic activity. And, you know, in research, helped a lot of people reestablish circadian patterns that they had lost. And last one is something that I've yet to use, but it's considered to be, you know, something that's going to be coming to market as a prescriptive drug. It's a peptide, lorazepam, and that's actually coming to market for celiac disease, because it helps in gut healing secondary from the damage from the celiac disease itself. Once again, this particular one, it was shared with me by people that have been using it as just, you know, a revolutionary aspect where, hey, we can stimulate your own body to heal itself, which is always a good thing. Now, I see that there's a number of questions that that popped up. So I will spend the rest of the time answering those questions and participate in any discussions that go from there.
Dr. Bush, do you want to take you off the share screen now, maybe, just so we see you?
Oh, sure.
That's okay.
My share screen might look prettier.
No, we like seeing your handsome face. So one of the first questions was, what brand of clothing was it that the EPA found those high heavy metals in? Do you know what that brand was? Just so none of us go and buy it.
Yes, let's see, stop sharing. There we go. Let me look it up. There's actually a handful of, I think it's called, well, one, I am not a teenage girl and I'm not shopping on Amazon. So I will reference that. FDA. One of them was like Sheeran. Let's see. Oop, wrong one there. I'll get back to you on that one.
No worries about that. A couple people were asking if you, who are the vision therapists you refer people to?
I send people, I mean, I'm here in Stillwater, so Woodbury Eye Associates, they have a vision therapy area, and they're part of a group, I think, of 4 or 5 places throughout the metro area. And I believe they have the vision therapy. So you can go to their website and check them out. They're all trained the same. They all have good technicians. And what I like about it is, I mean, there's some practitioners that do different vision testing and therapies, a number of chiropractic neurologists and stuff. They all dabble in it a little bit. But when you go to an optometrist office, they got all the big equipment and they're doing a very detailed scan. Many people's insurances cover it, or most of it, and including the vision therapy. So if they find problems, then you go there for different therapies and exercises, and it's all very structured. I mean, there's a process and a system to go through, and it's highly effective.
Awesome. Next question. I've been receiving treatment for chronic Lyme for over 3 years and have constant problems with dizziness and balance problems. Do you have any suggestions for working with these issues other than treating the underlying infection?
Yeah, well, when you have vestibular issues, I mean, you go into a couple different patterns. You got the neuroinflammation, which would be ubiquitous in that situation. You also have your, making sure you don't have any sinus issues, inner ear issues, mold exposures, very common side effect in that. And then, of course, your high histamine states, vestibular issues are very common because that creates that inner ear inflammation.
Thank you. Can you comment on Morley Robbins' root cause protocol to decrease inflammation with different types of magnesium?
No, I can't.
All right. And then this person also wants, infections can cause deposition of iron in the liver and spleen.
They could. Doesn't mean that you should avoid it if you're anemic.
Sure. What is the mechanism by which my Lyme infection is causing my post-exertional malaise syndrome?
A million different ways, unfortunately. So you could have downregulation of your endocrine system. You could have a upregulation of your histamine activity. You could have your blood sugar. I mean, unfortunately, things like chronic fatigue and malaise is universal when the body's not working right. So that's when you start piecing through the little puzzle, making sure you have a comprehensive, at least blood workup to at least start a roadmap of where to go. And unfortunately, everyone's a little bit different because, as you saw before, you could have the malaise and chronic fatigue from someone with, mold exposure to post-COVID to post-Lyme. Yeah, because unfortunately the body gets weak. No, that's like, people will say, well, I want my libido higher. All right, you want a high libido. If you're not healthy, nature doesn't want you to reproduce. That's the last thing we want to think about. So yeah, I mean, we'll help your libido once we figure out what's wrong with you. Saying, unfortunately, with the fatigue, the same thing, but it just goes into like, all right, well, what have you looked at first, and what breadcrumbs does the testing give you to kind of go forward with? Because unfortunately, you could throw darts in the night all night long and you won't hit it until you have a better idea of where the target is.
Great. Can you suggest a good allergist?
In the metro area, I'm sure they exist. I don't know of them. Someone like Dr. Rakota was on the line. She's been here and done that and got the t-shirt longer than I have. So she might have a better Rolodex of those. Most of the time, historically, I've sent people to the Allergy Associates of La Crosse, Wisconsin. They've had a lot of changeovers the last 5 years, and they're not the same as they used to be. But they still, from my understanding, still live better than the average bear. But there are some out there, and unfortunately, I apologize, I don't remember every allergist. Every so often, you hear one that actually does some intradermal testing to double check and verify certain things. And and if they do that, at least they're thinking and they're looking for the problem and not just giving you the blow off. And because it takes more time and effort to do that. And it's a sad thing about a lot of our insurance-based medicine is time is not an asset they have. It's high throughput. They don't get paid on outcomes. They get paid on how many people they see. So it sounds cynical, but in a lot of cases, like gastroenterologists and allergists, they have a small bandwidth for you. And if you're not in that bandwidth, then yeah, you're abnormal, you're atypical, and then you're moving on.
What is the difference between Lyme and myalgic encephalomyelitis?
I don't know at this right off the bat. You caught me off guard on that one.
Or ME or CFS, so chronic fatigue syndrome, basically.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's what chronic fatigue used to be called.
Used to be called. Yeah. So they're both descriptive terms. So if you have a Lyme disease that goes into the central nervous system, you get a neuroborreliosis. No matter what, in all of that, you're going to have chronic inflammation and neuroinflammation in the brain. Fibromyalgia, having inflammation of your muscles, but yet not detectable inflammation, right? It's just a perceived inflammation by pressing little points on the body. That type of, when I have a patient with fibromyalgia, I say, well, all right, it's affecting your whole body. If it's not autoimmune, it's going to be a chemistry change leading to hypersensitization of the muscles. So what in the chemistry has changed? And that's where things that are more of an overgrowth state come into play. In some studies, 98% of the patients with fibromyalgia have a bacterial overgrowth. And and more times than not, it's your gut, because that's your biggest colony of bacteria. And that usually can lead to it. We have some people that it's a chronic sinus infection that can lead to a fibromyalgia. And so once again, and that's all secondary to the immune cascade because of their presence and the metabolic byproducts of the bacteria. The lactic acid especially is a big contributor to muscle dysfunction.
The breath test that you do, does it actually identify the different kinds of bacteria, or does it just identify that there's a number of bacteria?
Yep. Looks for just the anaerobic fermenting bacteria. So if they're part of the overall group that ferments fibers and sugars, and they're anaerobic, they're gonna be the ones that produce hydrogen and methane. Those subclasses are supposed to be found in the large intestines for the most part, and in small amounts in the small intestines. So it's a macro interpretation, but the classes, those bacteria are 85% of what occupies in the gut. If you need more specifics, which we oftentimes will need, then the best testing that you have is going to be a stool test. Stool tests are not the best in the world to do because, well, one, you got to poop in a box. Number two, as a labs don't like stool because they're not only they messy, but they degrade and they only measure what's coming out. So there's a lot of infectious diseases or a lot of diseases in the colon that go without measurement because, well, guess what? They evolved not to come out. So some of the more sensitive genetic tests that are now available are better at identifying some of those. And we become, over time, I've become smarter using them, identifying even certain organisms. They might not be quote unquote elevated, but certain things you don't want to ever see. Like you don't ever want to see a Clostridium difficile toxin A or B. And we do see those on a basis, and I will screen them, especially if they have a bad SIBO, even before giving herbs, because I cause just as much C. diff with patients every year with my herbal treatments than I do with my antibiotic treatments. And so I've learned on the front end that when people have a lot of neurological issues associated with their gut, a lot of pain, I'll make sure I do a stool test to be sure there's no C. diff lurking, even if it's quote unquote a normal amount, if it's detectable, it puts me at a different idea about how I go about it. And instead of going guns blaze to try and weed the garden, I go in and try and enrich the soil to get you in a better place. And then if I have to come back to weed it, I can. But in certain cases, in a lot of those cases, it's like I don't even go there because it'll cause more harm than good.
Sure. Do we have any more questions? I think that we have hit all the ones that were in the chat. Does anybody have, we have a few minutes left here. Does anybody else have any other questions for Dr. Bush this evening? I'll give you a a little bit more time in case anybody has anything else. We got to thank you.
Well, it was my pleasure. And once again, thank
Well,
you.
if everybody, if there aren't any more questions, if people could turn their cameras back on and and they can unmute themselves at least, and we can give Dr. Bush a big round of applause and a big thank you. I'll give everybody a second. I know it takes a little time to find all the buttons. Remember, the mute button is going to be down on your left side on the bottom. You're going to hit that. Just want your video back up. You'll hit that little video camera that's there. There's Gail. Gail's on our board. Gail had a reverse shoulder replacement, so which is more complicated than a regular shoulder replacement. So she is sitting cozily in her lounge chair, I see.
And no clapping.
And no clapping for Gail.
Well, hey, I can totally feel you, man, because my butt got detached for about 6 months. So
wow, that's a long time to have it detached behind. So for any, I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm Dorian Chalmers. I'm part of the Minnesota Lyme Association board, as well as Gail here. And then also it popped up on that I can see anyway is Ann Muir, who is the founder of MLA. So I want to say hi to them and thank them for all the work that they do all the time. If you place a phone call, you're probably going to get Gail, and if Gail's not available, you're probably going to talk to Ann. So I want to thank them for all of the work that they do, reaching everybody's questions as much as they can. If this is your first time on here, if you have not signed up on our email list so that you get an e-blast whenever we're having a meeting, all you need to do is go to mnlyme.org. At the bottom of that homepage, it just says put in your email address, and then you'll get e-blasts about our meetings. That's really the only thing we send out stuff about. So we won't be filling up your email box with lots of other things. I have one more question. We are recovering from mold theoretically, but getting worse. Breathing problems, asthma developing, reflux, and gut worsening. How do you know if you should pursue finding tick infections versus if you are being exposed to more mold?
Well, a lot of times it's you could get out of the mold scenario, but you just got walloped with that category 4 hurricane of mold. And so a lot of the reactions that people will get with mold and persistently are going to be the hyperimmune reaction that you get from the mold. So you become highly allergic to it, which includes the mold in your gut and your nose, which is fungus. That can perpetuate it. And then you get the high histamine states. And then, of course, a downregulation of your detox ability, your glutathione production takes a dive. So acutely, you want to at least backfill and help support those important phase 2 detoxers. And more importantly, with certain types of hyperreactions, once again, the symptoms from these chronic inflammatory states overlap because it's the chronic inflammation and the neuroinflammation that causes it. So trying to, if you know that mold was the recent thing and things were going good up until then, well, one, the mold's going to expose problems, just like how COVID can expose, like, oh, wait, I was predisposed to an autoimmune disease and now I have one. And I was predisposed to low serotonin and now I have my depression's worse. it'll do the same thing. And likewise, the recovery rate post mold, it's a lot like Lyme. A big chunk of the people over the first 6 weeks away will have good repair, but there's going to be a lot more after 12 weeks being still bad, and then less of them, but having more problems, and up to years. I mean, we've had patients like slowly recover 2 years post a massive exposure because they're predisposed to that type of chronic inflammatory state. And something like mold is a category for a hurricane.
Yeah, they put moved out a year ago, remediated and retested, so we don't think there's still mold, but that doesn't mean you're still not having symptoms, correct?
Correct. And that's a big thing, because there's a lot of people that do mold testing, like urinary mold tests and stuff. And I'm not a big fan of it. I'll do it every so often, but the science isn't all that great. But when you know that you had exposure and you had the symptoms from there, it's, you start laying in that extra support for it. And there's a lot of good integrative docs around the metro area that are mold familiar. So.
And then one more question we had come in. Do you have an opinion on the efficacy of phage therapy for Lyme?
It needs more. It needs more research. It needs more people doing it. But I've known of phage therapy from Europe for a number of years, and I've known a lot of people that went to Europe to get it and got better for many different diseases. And I even met some old doctor who used to have he used to get milk that was produced by cattle purposely inoculated with certain diseases to pass on the phages. You gotta love old integrative docs. So I think it's something that we need to do more of, and two, unfortunately, it's just a hard thing to even get. So if you have the ability to do it, and if it's not horribly expensive, there's really not much downside to it.
Well, I think we're at about time here, but for those who've got their that are unmuted and have their cameras off, if we can give a big round of applause and thank you to Dr. Bush, that would be great.
Hi, Vic.
Hey.
So thank you again. I hope all of you have a great rest of your week. I hope some sunshine comes out this week. I hope we see you at our next meeting. We don't quite know what December is going to bring for us. We have to make a plan there. But like I said, keep watching your e-blasts. And we also do have a Facebook page, 2 Facebook pages, a public one, and we also have a private one if you want to become part of that, and we always post the information on there. So thank you again, Dr. Bush. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And everybody have a great rest of your November and a great Turkey Day if you celebrate with turkeys. So thanks everybody. Take care.
All right. Take care,
Bye.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.